have people introduced to this at an earlier stage, whether that's middle school or high school, because by the time a student gets to university, if he or she is completely unaware of Korean, or Korean literature, history, culture, language, it's less likely that he or she will even have the interest to take these courses. But what all of you are doing is exposing your students at an earlier age, which I think is very important, because when they get to a place like Ateneo, which has a proper Korean studies program, I think they're much more likely to, I guess it's a minor here, if there's a major, to major in it, or to minor in it. And so I think the earlier that this information is presented to students, the better in terms of the future of Korean studies for the Philippines, but anywhere really outside of Korea. Is that working? So which one is forward? Okay. The other way? Thank you. That made more sense. So this is a very difficult task for me for two reasons. One, you all just had lunch, so you probably want to take a nap, like me. But more importantly, even if it were in the morning or later in the afternoon, it's really 2,000 years of literature and literary history in 2 hours. So by necessity, I'll go very quickly, and this will remain on a kind of surface level. But I think it will give you an overview so that if you or your students are interested in a particular period or a particular genre or a particular writer, you can then go deeper, right? But in 2 hours, I apologize, but necessarily I'll have to be a little bit quick and a little bit shallow, right? So first of all, when we talk about Korea in quotation marks, I have it in quotation marks because, there were several kingdoms on the peninsula traditionally, and they didn't always see themselves as one unified country. Like anywhere else, the idea of nationalism and a unified country is rather late in coming. In any case, the Three Kingdoms period, we can at least start about 2,000 years ago, right? When we talk about Korean history, it's safe to start about 2,000 years ago. But the interesting thing, if you look, I don't know which one is my pointer. Which is the these two histories of the Three Kingdoms aren't written until the 12th and 13th century. In other words, 1,200 or 1,300 years after the things that they're talking about. So that's one issue that we'll have to keep in mind. And the terms I use are lag and embeddedness. Now what lag means is these histories are more than 1,000 years later than what they're supposed to be describing. It's not like now where if you were a historian, you might be writing about, I'm sorry, but let's say you wanted to write about Imelda Marcos's shoe collection. It's only, what, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years? It's not 1,000 years. It's sort of how we typically think about history. One generation maybe. And so we're always dealing with lag, or at least in early Korean history and literature. And then embeddedness, this is a word that I use to mean that much of Korean literature, early Korean literature, is embedded into Korean history. It's not like now where someone is a poet. I'm a poet, a professional poet, and I write poetry, and I publish poetry, and you all read it, and you like it, or you don't like it. Without the historical context, without the stories in which a lot of Korean literature is embedded, it isn't quite as meaningful. And I'll give you concrete examples of that, but it's important to keep these two things in mind. So it's really difficult to remove Korean literature from Korean history. And these are just visual. I don't want it all to be text because that can be boring. So I'll just give you some visual representations. This is the Samgitagi, written in Chinese, obviously, because even in the 12th century, the Hangul, which you all just learned about, had not been invented yet. This is the Samgul Musa, written a century later, but also all in Chinese because this is Korean history, and it's even recording Korean language sometimes, using the Chinese characters to reproduce Korean sounds, but there's no Korean writing system yet. So this is the translation is bad, but this is the translation that's been published. But here is a song or a poem from the Samguk, right? Fluttering, the orioles, male and female together. So, reminded of my loneliness, with whom will I ever be? So, it's of course the English translation is not wonderful, but it's also, this is embedded in. It's not supposed to be a standalone poem, right? When you pull it out like this and you remove this embeddedness, the poem isn't quite as good. But when it's inside a narrative of a love story or someone who is feeling, alone and forsaken, it makes more sense. The other thing, the other thing I want to talk about in terms of this is, and I may come back to this, but I also want us to be clear about literature's value as an artifact, right? So I think Korean literature, this very early Korean literature, is valuable as an artifact. And what I mean by that is, if you, instead of just as a beautiful poem or as a beautiful short story, when I think of an artifact, this is a perfect example. I don't want to break anything, but here it is. Sorry. If this were a Korean cup and it was 2,000 years old, it would be very valuable. It would be in the museum and it would be worth $1 million because it's the only one that we have left, right? That's that old. So if I drop it on the floor and break it, I'd love to do that for effect. Like I drop it on the floor and I break it, I'll probably go to jail, because I shouldn't be touching it in the first place. And it's a national treasure and it's gone forever and everyone's upset. But at one point 2,000 years ago, this was just a coffee cup. So if I drop this coffee cup, whoever has to clean it up will be angry at me. But the Philippine government won't put me in jail and I won't have to pay anyone $1 million because this is just a cup. But 2,000 years ago, that cup in the museum was just a cup or a bowl. And if you dropped it, your mother spanked you and said, "Why did you break my cup?" But then she could go get another one, right? So some of this literature is valuable for that. It's one of the few pieces we have left from 2,000 years ago. So we have to, the older the literature becomes, the more we value it as an artifact, more than comparing it, say, to contemporary poetry. So again, from the Three Kingdoms period, Shilla unifies the entire country in the 7th century. This isn't a history course. There are some losses in terms of needing Chinese help. There are some losses in terms of ceding a lot of the northern territories to China. But we have a unified country now on the peninsula. So, for about 1,300 years ago, there is a unification. Goryeo dynasty continues that unification, and it's one country on the peninsula still. And this is when, of course, Samguk is written. One thing I want to talk about with Samguk though, is it's written while Korea is under Mongol rule. So the Mongolians invade, and the Mongolians are controlling Korea. And I think, this is my own theory, but I think other people share it, that part of the reason for Samguk, and it's a very wonderful record of a lot of Korean culture and history, parallels what we see in my period. I'm not a specialist here. I'm a specialist in the 1930s, 1920s, and 1930s, when Korea is under Japanese colonial rule. And so there are a lot of similarities. I think it seems ironic that Korean literature from the 20s and 30s is so wonderful when the Japanese are ruling Korea. But if you think about it another way, there's this external pressure, and there's a fear among Koreans about their culture disappearing, and there's a fear among Koreans about their language disappearing. And so they are more proactive about preserving it and developing it, both for the Samguk under the Mongols, and then in the 10s and 20s and 30s under Japan. And I think it makes sense, right? Whereas now, because at least South Korea is so free and so prosperous, I think people are less concerned about the language, right? And people are less concerned about the culture and more interested in English and more interested in foreign culture. But this is natural. I don't think one is good and one is bad. But it's interesting to see that two of the real, I think, important periods for developing and preserving Korean language and literature and history and culture were under foreign occupation. The Korea side is interesting. Of course, it's a history, but when I talked about embeddedness, there are many literary works embedded inside the history of Korea. But this is interesting for here too, because when we talk about lag and embeddedness, the lag of Korea side is it's written, it's a history of Korea, but it's written at the beginning of the Joseon dynasty. So the Joseon king and politicians and literati are composing, after the fact, a history of the dynasty that they basically usurped, right? There was a coup d'etat. It's technically illegal. And so when they write the history of Korea, they cannot say something like, the Korea was wonderful, and we were simply greedy and wanted to take power, right? They have to write history and the literature that illustrates that history in such a way that also justifies their political actions. And of course, this is the same today. I mean, everyone always talks about your history is written by the winners, and it's always a bit biased. And I'm just pointing out that, and then I talked already about literature as artifact, right? The value of some of these literary pieces is their age and rarity as much, if not more than their quality as literature. And so, again, in the Hangmisa, you have some famous poems embedded inside the stories, historical stories. And this is about a half god, half man. He's a spirit turned into a man, a dragon with dragon spirit turned into a man. He marries a human female. He comes home one night, and there's actually a spirit. It's the like spirit of epilepsy, I guess. Like it's a disease. Who is sleeping with his wife? So he sees 4 legs, right? And he says, 2 of those legs are not mine. But the interesting thing about the story is, rather than killing his wife or killing both of them, he actually becomes very calm, and he goes outside and he sort of chants and dances, and the spirits think this is so wonderful, the fact that he has shown this restraint, that they actually, reward him for it. But again, this as a poem or a song, I mean, of course, part of it is the translation, but even in the original, in Chinese, it's not so much that it's a beautiful song as that the song illustrates the lesson, and the song gives depth to the historical tale being told. And here's the original. I mean, it's not original, but the original Chinese. And basically, what you see is that this is Choyongnan Mangesa. So these stories do 2 things. They introduce literature as history, or as illustrating history, but also it's also linguistics. So you just learned about Korean language. Well, all of these words come from somewhere, right? And there are native Korean words, but there are a lot of Sino-Korean words, and this actually also tells you how Mangesa becomes Mangesa. It means like a temple overlooking the ocean. And so the story is also an etymology for many Korean place names and Korean cultural practices, which is an interesting function of literature, which really doesn't apply, again, to like 20th century literature, which is more of a standalone art form. So literature, and here's the Korea, so the history of the Korea dynasty. So literature has different functions, right? Very different functions in pre-modern Korea. And it's very important to note also, there, even through the Joseon dynasty, which I'm getting to, I'll skip over these, right? So even when we get to the Joseon dynasty, which was the most recent dynasty before the Japanese occupation of Korea, still there were no professional writers. So it's particularly because the Joseon dynasty, so Goryeo is this sort of state religion and ideology. of Goryeo was Buddhism, and actually it was Buddhism before that in unified Silla. From the Joseon dynasty, there's a conscious move to Confucianism. And particularly under Confucianism, it would have been unthinkable for someone to sell his or her literary production. To write a poem or to write a novel, people did this, but there was no sense of this as a profession. It would have been considered extremely low class to do this. What you wrote to share with your friends and to kind of display your learning, right? You would display your erudition in classical Chinese, and whether that's literature, or philosophy, history, and your friends would reply with their own poems or but no one was thinking about making money. So it is, though, in the Joseon dynasty where we begin to overcome lag. In other words, from the Joseon dynasty, history is written in what I'll call real time. So the Goryeo is written by scholars in the Joseon dynasty. But during the Joseon dynasty, there are government officials whose job it is to write history day by day. Of course, it's high history. It's history of the king and history of the royal palace, but still, it is in real time. So that is where we start to overcome this idea of lag. But embeddedness does not disappear. There's still no professional authors. There's still no idea of art for art's sake, or literature for literature's sake. And so everything is still embedded in some sort of historical or cultural or political narrative. I don't know how much of this will be redundant from the earlier lecture, but of course we have the question of language, because the Joseon dynasty begins in 1392, but it's not until several decades later that there's actually a Korean writing system, 1443, 1445, and even then, it's not widely used. It's available, but not widely used. So, Hungminjeongeum, now Hangul in South Korea. This, by the way, North Koreans don't use this start. And because of this, both officially and unofficially, it's now possible for the first time to write in Korean. So officially, King Sejong has this commission, right? It's a history of his family. It's a history through literature as kind of an extended poem, very extended, of the Yi family who founded the Joseon dynasty. And there are other things like Hongyurtongjeong, which are completely unofficial and not commissioned by anyone, and much more like adventure stories. And then, of course, the works in literary Chinese remain, and in fact remain in the great majority. So there is now the possibility of writing in Korean, but still it's not quite as popular or prolific as writing in Chinese. This is one version of the Hungminjeongeum, so the introduction of the Korean writing system. And still, there's a reliance on Chinese characters to show exactly what is being said and how it should be written in this new script. So you see an interesting mix of Korean and Chinese here, and even the Korean is archaic, right? It's not the present orthography, but it just shows you that it's ironic, but in order to teach literate Koreans Korean, they needed Chinese, right? Because they had been relying on Chinese for so long. And then this is what we are talking about. This is the sort of lyric poem commissioned by King Sejong in Korean to give the history of his family and how they came to rule over Korea in the Joseon dynasty. And then this is the tale of Hongyurtong. You can see that even though the characters by this time are a little bit more familiar to you than the earlier ones, you notice no spacing and no punctuation, right? Because punctuation is embedded into the words, right? It's actually unnecessary. Not that this is easy to read at all, but it still was readable to everyone because it wasn't necessary. Punctuation is brought in by American missionaries, right? Spacing and punctuation is kind of copying English already. I think it does make Korean easier to read, even for Koreans, but it's not something that was originally in the language or the literature. This is Gunmo, a famous novel that was in Chinese. So just to show you that even in the same period, some people said, well, I know there's this Korean writing, but I prefer to write in Chinese. And in fact, there were Yangbanya, there were aristocrats, government officials, who argued that, I mean, now there's a Hangul Day, a holiday, and this is one of the greatest achievements of Korean culture, I think. But you have to know at the time there was a huge backlash, and scholars were saying things like the Mongols have their own writing system, and the Manchus have their own writing system, and only barbarians have their own writing system. We, civilized people use Chinese. Why are we fooling around with this barbarian writing system? So it wasn't from the beginning, something that all Koreans were behind. So this gets very technical, and I'm not going to say waste, but I won't spend too much time with it. There's no clock on the wall, is it? I can just keep looking. No, I have my phone. I'll just look from time to time. So, Shijo is a shorter, and we were talking about it at lunch. It's a shorter and somewhat more fixed poetic form. It's in Korean, not in Chinese, and it has a very definite syllable and line count. Kasa is longer, can be more narrative sometimes, and is less bound by these rules. And then Hanshi is just Korean poetry but written in Chinese. So this exists even today. I mean, as a hobby mostly, but Koreans still compose Korean poetry in literary Chinese. And in my last slide, and at the end, around, what time did we start? 3 o'clock, I'll talk about the ideas about language and literature, right? Because I want to challenge certain assumptions and provoke you to think a little bit. But for now, let's just say, at the time, in terms of poetry, people were writing both in Korean and in Chinese, even though Korean was available. And in prose also, you had people writing in Korean, but I think more writing still in literary Chinese. So probably the most famous Shijo exchange, and this is also shows you the embeddedness, because without the history, this is almost meaningless. But if you know the history, like I said, the eventual founder of the Joseon dynasty, if you are a member of the Koryo dynasty, he's a criminal, right? He's trying to stage a coup d'etat. So he's staged this coup d'etat, and his son, Ibangan, is the son of the new king, and Song Mong-ju is a loyal minister of the Koryo dynasty, and they have this exchange. And you can read it, and it's okay as poetry, but in terms of history and the way it's embedded in a historical narrative, it's very significant, right? And what's interesting is even though this from the perspective of the Joseon dynasty, even though this person was not loyal to them and did not support them, he was loyal. So he's still an exemplar of Confucian virtue. So there's a little bit of a dilemma here, because here we have the king's son, and he eventually becomes king himself, and of course he's part of the new dynasty. So any history like the Koryo has to paint this person in a positive light, but they can't also make this into a black and white story of hero and villain, because Song Mong-ju died for loyalty to the previous dynasty and to the previous king, which of course is a virtue that the new dynasty also wants to encourage. So there's an interesting kind of tension here, even though the poems themselves may not be wonderful. And here they are in Korean for those of you who are interested. I couldn't find anything very high resolution. Sorry about the fuzziness. But even here, when we talk about lag a little bit, there was no Korean writing system when this historical exchange happened. So there was a historical exchange between Lee Bang-won and Jung Mong-gi. But anything they wrote would have been written in Chinese. What they said would have been said in Korean. But if they wrote anything to each other, it would have been in Chinese. But then later, once there is a Korean writing system, then it becomes possible to translate or at least write down this as a Korean or two Korean shijo. Again, when we're talking about the importance of context and inventiveness, if you read this, what do you think? At least in English, it's kind of again, but like I said, even at this time, it's not so much this as a standalone poem as the story, and basically, these are all homophones and puns. Like these are people's names, but written in different Chinese characters, right? So it is actually a man named Hyuk-il-soo, even though the Chinese characters were most, I'm 99% sure they were different. And so Hang Jin-hee has written this shijo ostensibly about a stream, but using a homophone for the man's name. I don't know if it makes sense. In some ways, these are so embedded that unless you read the entire history, it's hard to make sense of it. But I guess if you get it, that's wonderful. And if you don't get it, it proves my point, right? If you don't understand it, it actually proves my point that it is that embedded and it is that contextually dependent that it can be hard. Whereas these days, if you read a Korean short story or you read a poem, you shouldn't really need context. It should be beautiful or not beautiful. It should be compelling or not compelling. But the traditional idea of literature was quite different, right? Okay, so I'm not gonna, I don't think I took Stephen F. Sen's advice to only spend 5 minutes on pre-modern, but yeah, I got through that kind of quickly. I do apologize if you are very interested in pre-modern literature, but my sense is that your students are more interested in modern and contemporary literature, and so I'll spend a little more time on that. But during Q&A, I'm very happy to go back and talk about anything you're interested in. I also talked about this at lunch. I think Q&A is very important, and I may even give you a little extra time because when I teach my own students, but also if I give a lecture to teachers like this, I do take it very seriously, and I do spend a lot of time preparing, but I don't know all of you, so I'm just preparing in my own head. What do I think is important? What do I think is important? Or what do mostly Korean literary scholars think is important? But that has nothing to do with what you are interested in or what you think is important or what your students might find compelling. And so Q&A is very important in that sense because this is 2,000 years of literature and literary history. We can talk about this for, an entire semester, and still not have exhausted it. So during Q&A, I'll be able to guide my lecture more towards what you find confusing or interesting or what you think your students might. Anyway, when we move to modern or early modern Korean literature, there are a lot of arguments about when to begin this. If you're more nationalistic, you might start finding modern literature in the 18th century. If you are less nationalistic, you think it's in the 20th century. And everywhere in between, right? It depends, and I'll talk about the reasons for that. But the three main versions of this between transplantation and continuity. So transplantation is a direct translation of, there's a literary critic and poet, Im Hwa, very important, left-leaning but very important critic, and he was quite dismissive, let's say, or negative concerning Korean literary tradition, and he used I should have put it up here, but he used the term ishik, which is a botanical term for transplanting a flower or transplanting a tree. It's literally from botany, right? It's talking about flowers and trees. And he called it ishik vunakdo, right? The theory of transplantation or transplanted literature. And so his assertion was modern Korean literature, and oh, by the way, so for simplicity's sake, when I talk about traditional literature versus modern literature, it's not, there are very modern pieces before the 20th century, and there are still very traditional pieces being written today, but for convenience sake, I'll say 20th century. Like now we're talking about from 1900 on, let's say. So this idea of transplantation, Imhwa believed and wrote that there's no relationship between modern Korean literature and traditional Korean literature, and basically modern Korean literature is transplanted. It's like if I dug up a tree in France and planted it right here at Ateneo, right in the yard here, it's still a French tree. It's not a Filipino tree, right? I just planted it here, but it completely grew up in France. And he had that very kind of simplistic and negative view of Korean literature. It's totally Western, and we just transplanted it into Korean. And I think that's very simplistic and very negative. But the opposite was this idea of continuity, that no, modern Korean literature is sort of this unbroken tradition, and traditional Korean literature basically just organically morphs into modern Korean literature. And this is too positive. If Imhwa is too negative, this is too positive. It's too generous towards Korea, and it's too dismissive of what happened with the influx of foreigners. So what I like to teach is hybridity, and I mean this in a positive way. Some people think anything that's not pure is somehow dirty or negative, but I don't believe that at all. I think some of the healthiest and most vibrant forms of culture, including literature, are hybrids. And so the scholars that I trust and the scholars that I kind of follow use this term problematic continuity. And problematic here doesn't mean it's a problem. It means it's complicated, right? It means what they mean by problematic, what they mean by problematic is this is too simple and too negative. This is too simple and too positive. And it's hybridized and it's problematic and it's complicated. So what it is, and let me see where I started here. What I try to teach my students is that Imhwa is partially right. There is a transplantation that's occurring, and the nationalist scholars are partially right. There are a lot of traditional aspects left in modern Korean literature. And so what I think of is the genres, like the modern novel, it's important. Modern poetry, free verse poetry, it's important. So those are important. But those are boxes. They're not like trees and flowers. They're boxes, and they're empty boxes. So you import the empty box, which is the modern novel, or you import the empty box, which is the modern free verse poem. But what you put in that box is Korean. The contents, it's a foreign box filled with Korean things, right? So that's the metaphor or the kind of analogy I try to use so my students understand what is meant by problematic continuity. Because the characters and the sentiments and the events and all of these things are absolutely Korean, even from 1906. So the new novel, this idea of new novel, modern novel, the reason I have it in quotation marks is because obviously the new novel is also hybridized. There are many traditional aspects. And the modern novel, there are many pre-modern aspects. But for teaching and writing textbooks, you need these dates, right? You need things to begin and end in order to give students tests and in order to teach things in a short period of time in a kind of simplified way. So the new novel is basically 1906. It's Ian Jik's Tears of Blood, and I'll talk about the relationship with the Philippines, because one of the instructions was to talk about maybe the relationships between the Philippines and Korea. And now we can really start to talk about that. So what happens in 1905? Let's talk about history a little, because even here, we can't disconnect Korean literature from history. Korean literature is always very connected to history. So in 1905, what happens is the Japanese force the Koreans to sign a protectorate treaty. This is the beginning of colonization. It doesn't happen legally until 1910, but it kind of happens de facto in 1905. And this has to do already with the Philippines, because you guys probably know from learning your own history. Do you guys learn about the Katsura secret agreement? Do you learn about this? It's very scandalous. Okay, so you should, as educators in the Philippines, you should all know this. So there was a secret agreement between Taft, who was Secretary of State and later President of the United States, and Katsura, who was his equivalent in Japan. And basically, Japan and America traded Korea and the Philippines. So America said, we want the Philippines, and Japan said, we want Korea, and we each promised each other not to interfere. Like, you take the Philippines, we'll take Korea, and we won't interfere with each other. So already, the Philippines and Korea were related by kind of imperialism and colonialism. Then in 1906, the first new novel is written by Yonsei, and it's called Tears of Blood, but this was already an adaptation of Jose Rizal's novel, Touch Me Not. What's the yes. So this was adapted into Japan as Tears of Blood, Chi no Nabida, by Yamada Pimyo, I think. And then Yonsei, who had studied in Japan, used the title, but then changed the characters and the settings and the storyline to Korea. So there's a difference between translation, which is just, someone takes Shakespeare in English and translates it into Korean. And adaptation is you take the idea of the story, but you change it, you localize it, right? So the first new novel is already an adaptation of a Jose Rizal novel. So another connection between early modern Korean and Philippine history and literary history. And then the modern novel comes about a decade later, 11 years later, 1917. And this is Lee Kwang-soo, who Professor John Lee talked about yesterday. He's the father of modern Korean literature, but he's also a trader. So there's all kinds of irony and angst surrounding him. But what should be said is that there are many new things about the new novel, women's education and strength in Korea and studying abroad and all these things, but there are also a lot of traditional elements. And then this is more modern, but it still has a lot of overlap with the new novel. And this Onmunichi is taken right from Japan, Kenbunichi. This is something that's really important. These were the first people, about 100 years ago, right? It's literally like 101 years ago that Yonsei wrote the first modern novel, in 1917, are the first ones to try to make written Korean correspond to spoken Korean. Because for centuries, there was just written Chinese and spoken Korean. And then there was written Korean and spoken Korean, but they were quite different. And it was only the idea of a modern novel. And of course, Japan took it from the West, and Korea took it from Japan. This is not pro-Japanese at all. This is like pro-modernity. But the idea that we should be writing the same Korean that we're speaking, right? This is a very modern and very new idea. And I'll show you something quite interesting. I'm going to skip over that. Here's one of the covers of Tears of Blood. Now you can all read this, right, after this morning's session. You have to read it backwards, by the way. Right to left. Good. And you can see he basically has Korean here and then Sino-Korean here. But this is actually interesting as well. So this is the first installment of Bujang, which is the first modern Korean novel. You'll see Bujang, the title is here. This is very interesting for a few reasons. This is the front page the front page of the January 1st, so the first day of the first month of 1917. But it's in the Japanese government's newspaper. So there's a really tense and weird relationship between the fact that Japan has, on the one hand, colonized Korea and is oppressing Korea, but at the same time, their government newspaper is the one printing modern Korean literature, right? So it's not. What I think you need to know about the colonial period is from 1905, and especially from 1910 to 1945, on a political level, there's really no excuse. It's illegal, it's immoral, there's no excuse for Japan politically. But on a cultural level, it's much more gray and complicated because Japan is also doing things inadvertently to promote Korean literature and culture. And by the way, Lee Kwang-soo originally planned, and the advertisement for this was in mixed script. So until this point, everything had a lot of Chinese characters. Any educated Korean was very comfortable with those Chinese characters. And even just slightly before this, there was an advertisement. Next year, on January 1st, we're going to have this brand new novel, Bujang. And the whole advertisement is in mixed script, Hangul and Chinese. Lee Kwang-soo made a last-minute decision to put it all in Hangul. So this Bujang is in Chinese, and Chunwon, his pen name, is in Chinese, and everything else is in Korean. Pure Hangul. So the first modern novel is also the first modern pure Hangul novel, because even after this, people chose to use a lot of Chinese characters, and even when I was learning Korean until the 90s, any newspaper, any textbook, any academic article was filled with Chinese, and now it's gone. But that's only the last 20 years. Another thing about lag and embeddedness, too. This is more like lag. Almost every early modern Korean novel before the end of the colonial period began as a newspaper or journal article. The newspaper would be every day, journal could be every week or every month, but in other words, serialized in installments, the way now you watch your favorite TV show every Friday night, right? And later, if they were not popular, they disappeared. If they were popular, then they made a book. But this was always after the fact, so it's also important. Now we pick up books. Does someone have a nice, beautiful, tall book today? Anyway, you have a book, right? An artifact, a book, and you think of Mudong and all these things as a book like this, but they really weren't. They were these daily installments that people were writing, and only later, if they were popular enough, they were turned into books. So the whole publishing industry was quite different. I will say, however, that Lee Kwang-soo is also important because he's the first professional Korean writer. Like I said, the Joseon Dynasty, unthinkable to be a professional writer. That would be the lowest thing you could do. Lee Kwang-soo was the first Korean to make his living solely by writing literature and also, essays and op-ed pieces, articles. And in fact, he wrote an essay. I should have had a picture up here. It's great, called Munagiran Hao, which means what is literature. And he had to describe to Koreans that literature was actually an occupation, not just a hobby, right? It was an occupation and it was valuable and people were professional writers. But what's also interesting is he had to use the English word, literature, to describe the Sino-Korean word 문학, because educated Koreans did not know what 문학 meant, but they did know what literature in English. Because the character 문, they knew, that meant prose as opposed to poetry. Hak, they knew, meant how to study or discipline. But the modern word 문학 didn't exist until about 100 years ago. And he had to tell Koreans what it meant and why it was different than 문, that idea of 문 in the Joseon Dynasty. Very interesting as well is this decade of 1935 to 1945, because it gets kind of glossed over and it disappears. If you read a Korean literary textbook, it will say like the novels of the 1910s, the poems of the 1910s, and then the novels of the 1920s, the poems of the 1920s, et cetera, et cetera. And then in the 40s it disappeared, and then they start again, you know, after liberation. What happens after liberation? And these 10 years, they disappear. So I have dark years in quotation marks because on the one hand, people talk about the Japanese colonial period as the Dark Ages. They use the term ambuki, and they mean it in terms of like political repression and cultural repression. But I also have it in quotation marks because it's dark, partially because it was politically dark, but also because it's unexplored by Korean scholars. They leave it alone because it's very problematic and very explosive. So in the 30s, I'm going to talk about 1935 to 1940 and 1940 to 1945 as very different. They're not the same at all. So from the 1930s, at least until 39, was a time of immense cultural freedom. So not political freedom, but cultural freedom. And if you look at the novels from that time, they explore a lot of topics that don't reappear in Korean literature until the end of the 20th century or even the beginning of the 21st century. They explore homosexuality, they explore the so-called international marriage, they explore traveling abroad, and all these things that you never saw in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s Korean literature, South Korean literature, and certainly not in North Korean literature. So in that sense, even though politically there was a lot of repression, culturally there was quite a bit of freedom and quite a bit of experimentation in Korean literature. Now, of course, from 39-40 until 1945, you have total mobilization. So what I would like to say about this is this really was the Dark Ages. The last 5 years really were the Dark Ages. But it's important, I think, to realize that this wasn't a kind of evil plan by Japan to solely exploit Korea. It was that Japan was at war with the US, and Japan was at war with Russia, China, all countries that are much bigger, more people, more natural resources. It's incredible in some ways that Japan lasted until 1945. But in order to last until 1945, they had to completely mobilize. That means they mobilized Japan and Korea and Taiwan, the Philippines, wherever they were, right? And what mobilization means is, you know, your child has a soccer ball, we need that to make Jeep tires. You know, you have nice silverware, we need that to make bullets. So some Koreans mistakenly say they're destroying Korean culture. Well, Korean culture was destroyed, but all of these things happened in Japan and Taiwan and the Philippines. It was just, they didn't have enough resources, and so everything had to be mobilized for the war effort, basically. But this is when Koreans are forced to write in Japanese. Koreans are, people like Lee Kwang-soo are encouraging young Koreans to join the Japanese army and writing this in Japanese. So it is a dark period in that sense as well. At the end of which there's a kind of reckoning, like Lee Kwang-soo has to write a confession, Dai Gobek, and Che Man-sik writes a confession, Minjogye Che, enemy of the nation, right? Criminal against the nation. And so there is a reckoning against a lot, not all, there were some authors who choose not to write. You could choose just not to write, but if you wrote, you were pressured to write in Japanese or pro-Japanese content. But some, like Pang Sun-won disappeared, Lee Tae-jun moved out to Gangwon-do. I mean, some had a choice, which is why people like Che Man-sik and Lee Kwang-soo were held accountable, because they did continue writing, and they wrote in Japanese, and they wrote pro-Japanese, which was, there was a lot of pressure, but it wasn't necessary. Like other authors proved you could avoid it if you wanted to avoid it. Moving forward, these are just some of to show you newspaper. So they were newspapers, and then later, like this is 3 Generations by Young Thumbs Up, they would be made into books if they were popular enough. Was the original title for Peace Under Heaven, by, and this is when it's changed. So when it was in the magazine, it was serialized under one title, and when it was printed as a novel, then the title was changed, rearranged and shortened slightly. Okay, so what happens after 1945? Korea is liberated, not independent. I mean, not really. I mean, liberation is interesting, right? Because on the one hand, liberated from Japan into America, right? So America is still really, a military government is running Korea at least for 2 years, from 1945 to 1947, 48. And in 1948, there are separate elections, and that's what sort of solidifies the division of Korea, which we still are dealing with today. And then in 1950, we have war. So 45 to 50 is, 51 is an extremely traumatic period in Korean literature, and that obviously manifests itself in literature. These short stories that I'm talking about are not always written in 1945 or 1960. Some of them are written later, but they're dealing with the issues of this time. And Kapitan Ri is a really famous story about someone who's in North Korea. He's a medical doctor. He's in North Korea, and he sort of voluntarily only speaks Japanese in his home. It's Korean. He only speaks Japanese. He gives his daughter a Japanese name. He's a model citizen. And then, when the Russians, the Soviet Union takes Japanese surrender north of the 38th parallel, and the U.S. takes Japanese surrender south of the 38th parallel. And when the Soviet Union comes in, he's branded as a traitor, and he's thrown in jail, and he'll possibly die. So what does he do? Well, he learns Russian, and he gets a good relationship with the Russian officers and manages to survive. Then during the war, he comes to South Korea, and he learns English, and he makes a good relationship with an American diplomat and sends his daughter to America. And so he's like, on the one hand, he's portrayed as this traitor because of what he did with Japan and Russia and America. But on the other hand, he's kind of the quintessential Korean because he survives and he does what he needs to do. So I really, this is a good point to talk about nationalism and identity. I'm going to end the talk of talking about nationalism and identity, but just to preview it, I want you to think about this. There may be analogous situations in the Philippines as well, because of Spain and because of the U.S. But we all have multiple identities. So you're here as teachers, but you're also somebody's son, somebody's daughter, sister, brother, wife, husband. Not only, I mean, the macro level, if you ask someone this, I'm Korean, I'm Filipino, I'm American, it's the biggest identity, but because it's big, it's also kind of the least significant. It's an accident, it's just where you were born. But then you have your relationship to your own parents, and then your relationship to your siblings or your children if you're old enough. And these become smaller but more meaningful. And so looked at only from a nationalist perspective, some of these characters, like Kapitan Ri, are negative. But if you think about multiple identities, and you think about, well, he's also someone's husband, he's also someone's father, how can he only think about Korea versus Japan when he has to think about what's going to happen to my son, what's going to happen to my daughter, what's going to happen to my wife? So it's important not to ignore one or the other, but again, this idea of hybridity also applies to individual stories and individual characters. I think it's important to never forget the national narrative and the national identities here, but also get a bit more granular and a bit more specific and talk about these individuals. What I do with my Korean students, because they've often been brainwashed in high school. They've been brainwashed to think like, oh, this person's evil and this person's good. And this story is bad and this story is good. And what I do is, in fact, do we have any Koreans? We had a Korean student here earlier helping, no? It would be better if we had a Korean student. But anyway, well, I can do it because it's hypothetical. What I do is, I would ask you, I'd say like, what does your father do? And they'll say like, oh, he works for a company. What does your mother do? She's at home or she's a school teacher. Okay, great. How many sisters and brothers do? They'll say, oh, 2 sisters, 1 brother. Great. And I establish all that. And then I say, if tomorrow, this is 2018, right? If tomorrow Japan re-invaded Korea and colonized Korea, would your father be happy? And there's, no, he would hate it. Would your mother be happy? No. Would you be happy? No. That's okay. That's just like 1910, right? But 98% of Koreans are not happy about the situation. I said, however, would you tell your father, Dad, because only Korea is important. I'm not important, you're not important. Quit your job, find a gun, move up into the mountains and become a guerrilla fighter, and I'll drop out of university, and my brother will drop out of university. And then they all say, no, I have to finish university. And I don't want my dad to become a guerrilla fighter, right? So it helps, I think, to just remind people that there are other identities besides Korea and Japan, or in this case of Korea and Russia, Korea and America. These people are all someone's mother, someone's father, someone's sister, or a student or a teacher, and they have to fulfill all these different identities. And it's admirable when someone sacrifices everything for the nation. Everyone respects that, but it also leaves their family in a very difficult position. And we see that a lot in Korean literature. There is a lot of trauma in the stories following this, as you would expect, post-war. You have this urge to return to an undivided Korea, a simpler Korea, or more rural and peaceful Korea. But when I say to where and what, the irony here is that a lot of historians or literary scholars, they start in 1945 as if there is no continuity. Like it's just, there's no history. And they romanticize these characters' desire to return to their simple life before division, or their simple life before the Korean War. But what we always have to remember is, and that's romanticized, that's a beautiful life. But we have to remember that beautiful life was under Japanese occupation. And they forget that. They just start in 1945, or they start in 1950, and it's important to remember that all of this is continuous. And when they talk about the 1920s or the 1930s, they say it was hell. But then when they go to 1945, they say it was heaven. But they're talking about the same period, one time as lived experience and one time as nostalgia. It's an interesting sort of laugh. Cranes is a really famous short story. We don't have time to get into it. But there are stories at this time that bravely discuss the possibility, even need for reconciliation. And that so if this is a kind of romantic nostalgia that ignores the troubles of the past, this is a more realistic nostalgia that celebrates the possibilities of the past, right? So Korea wasn't only under Japan before 1945 or 1950, but also unified, right? And also especially these villages right along the DMZ and right along the 38th parallel, they had no need to be divided. But during the war, some friends went north and some friends went south. And this story and other stories like it are nice because they use the flashbacks to the past to show that division isn't necessary, and division isn't natural, and division isn't permanent, right? It can be overcome, and that Korea as a nation and Koreans as individuals have a shared history. Doesn't matter if it was under Japan or during the Chosun dynasty or whatever, but there's a shared history that if they can reconnect with that, there are possibilities, because in many ways the divide is artificial. Moving into the late 20th century, we get people start to, the war is fading in people's memory, and modernization is in full swing, and there are positive sides to modernization, better living conditions, more money, more food, but there are negative parts of modernization. I mean, think about trying to drive in Manila, and it takes 3 hours to get to our hotel. I mean, there's negative sides to development, right? And so, Seoul 1964 Winter discusses military coup and the ensuing politics, because of course, former President Ateneo in 1960, he takes the country by force, and there's a very oppressive side to that, and then a little wall launched by the dwarf, it's famous, it's a decade later, but it's about, there's all this development and a certain segment of Korean society getting rich, but this explores that segment that is left behind and uprooted and displaced from their houses and cheated and by rich developers. And then finally, identical apartments is the next decade, and who's been to Seoul? Who's been to Seoul? I mean, this is, identical apartments discusses this loss of the kind of neighborhood, loss of the neighborhood where people know each other and people are in small houses. And although we have more money and more affluence, what's the price? What's the psychological price? What's the human price of all this development? Because you can see, and this is already old. This is already an old photo, but the isolation sort of, and the isolation and uniformity that comes from this new mode of living in 1980s and even until today. Korea, because if you would have lived in a neighborhood, for better or worse, you had a lot of contact with your neighbor. And now, it's very different. Even people are living right next to each other, but they don't know each other. Has anyone read it's translated into English, Hagwon-seo, Identical Apartments. Has anyone read this? First of all, I highly recommend it. It's in English. If your Korean's good enough, Hairun Bangde. That's the Korean title. And this is important too, because I think it's a horrible translation. Although it's a good translation if you look at what Seoul looks like, identical apartments, Hagwon-seo did something with the title. It's not identical apartments, it's similar rooms, right? Not identical either, right? Similar rooms. And this is important, I think, because I'm going to talk about female women writers, but I think she's probably, when she thought about rooms, she's already thinking of Virginia Woolf, and rooms are, this is, so it's very important about this. Apartments, this is external similarity, right? These all look different on the outside, but if you go into them, they'll be very different because people have different personalities. So they're concrete blocks, right? It's like what I said about Imwa. The box is the same, but you fill it with different things. So my apartment looks like this, actually, but my room doesn't look like this because it has my stuff in it. And the next apartment over has his or her stuff. And so Pak's title was actually done a disservice because identical apartments makes us think of this. Similar rooms is worse because identical on the outside is not that bad. Because on the inside, you can have freedom and difference. But hers is that inside the apartment and inside these two women's heads in the apartment, they're too similar, unhealthily similar, right? So if you ever read it, just keep that in mind. And so that leads us organically into this idea of women writing. This is not my turn, so don't yell at me. But I'm not going to give anyone a break. We'll just break before Q&A, because we're almost done. So this word yoyutaka, it's a really weird word to me now, but it was the term used, and it actually means like women type or women division authors. And so when I first went to Korea, and I'm like looking for Hagwon-seo or someone in the Korean literature section, I'm like, it's all alphabetical, right? So and then I'm done. I'm like, where is she? And then I went, and this is the 1980s, and then I went and asked her, like, oh yeah, she's over there. Yoyutaka, different section. It's like the ghetto, you know? And this was actually totally normal until recently. Like, oh yeah, there's Korean literature, and then there's that women's stuff. And nobody really challenged that. And what's interesting is, so like if there's women writers and segregation, but at the turn of the century, and when I say turn of the century, I mean between 20 and 21st. So now, when we come into the 21st century. What's interesting about the Korean case is it wasn't a kind of unified feminist objection to this, which would have been legitimate. It would have been legitimate for women authors to kind of unionize or band together, and I'm sorry I've been ignoring you because I'm a projector of that. Unionize and band together and say, this is very prejudicial, this is very negative, we want you to eliminate this term, and just, there's Korean literature. It doesn't matter if it's written by, I mean, you don't have one for like young writers and old writers, right? So why is it men and women? They didn't do that. What happened was actually quite interesting. It wasn't an organized feminist approach. It was that women writers from about the end of the 20th century until today, until right now, women writers quietly and alone, just working individually, just began to dominate. So they won all the prizes. You know, they're winning all the prizes, and they're getting all the best reviews. And so this idea probably, this Yoryuzaka idea probably persists among some older people. But now, both inside Korea and in, you know, at least in English translation, I'm mostly familiar with English translation. Since the best writers are women, this term becomes redundant and it becomes meaningless. And now it's like, oh, who won the Isang Bunak-san, right? Who won this prestigious prize last year? And then it's like a woman thing. Oh, but who won the other prize last year? And it's a woman thing. And so Korean literature, the best Korean literature, because it's being written by women, this is kind of organically and naturally kind of faded, but not with any kind of political movement or opposition, which I find very interesting. Like I said, I don't think it would have been wrong if people were offended, but I think even the women themselves, because they were raised in that system, they were kind of blind to the weirdness of it. It didn't seem weird to them because that's all they ever knew. But I hope it's kind of disappearing because they're just sort of dominating at this point. And this is the Chinese characters, right? This is a Yoryuba. And this was, a literary journal produced for women, but they used this, right? Now, I think, this is my last slide. We'll talk a bit here. So I think at the end of the 20th century, and especially in the 21st century, Korea has matured a lot, and Korean literature has matured a lot. There was a nationalism in literary production, and there was a nationalism in literary criticism, which I'm not a producer, I'm more of a critic, and everything had to be nationalistic, and everything had to be anti-Japanese, and everything had to be pushing for unification. And now I think people are much better scholars, and they're looking at a much wider range of topics. So the writers are writing about more than just nationalism or division, and the scholars are looking at more than just nationalism and division. And there's a re-examination and a nuanced discussion of the Japanese colonial period without apologizing for Japan, admitting what was actually bad and what was actually good rather than making it black and white. Writers like Kim Yong-ha and Hangak are much more experimental and much less concerned with, national division. They're much more personal, introspective, psychological. It's not these macro narratives about North and South Korea or war and division anymore. And what I really want to end with, and this also will tie in Korea and the Philippines because I was specifically asked to do that. What I really want to end with is these questions of language and ethnicity. So I already talked about the fact that there was a lot of Korean literature before 1445 and the promulgation of Hangul or the writing system that was written in classical Chinese. Now, there's no sensible way to argue that that is Chinese literature. Koreans are writing it in Korea. They're living in Korea. They are Koreans, or the Joseon dynasty subjects, Goryeo dynasty subjects, Shilla dynasty subjects, And they're writing these things, so just because they're using the medium of classical Chinese does not make it Chinese literature, it's Korean literature. I think that's obvious. A few people very early on, like Su, argued that that wasn't true, and even they realized how ridiculous that was, and they quickly changed their story. But we have a potentially similar situation now. And in fact, it's even more complicated because on the one hand, I'm teaching at Yonsei University, but within the university, I'm at an international college, so all of the required courses are in English, but about 75% of our students are Korean, which means Korean passport. Like the government defines them as Korean. But when they do a creative writing class, I teach a translation class, but when they do a creative writing class, because we have creative writing too, they're writing poetry and short stories and novels in English. But they're Korean. They self-identify as Koreans. The government who issues their passport says you're Korean. Their parents tell them they're Korean. They're writing this stuff at Yonsei University in Seoul, Korea. So it has to be Korean literature, just like the stuff 1,000 years ago written in Chinese was Korean literature. So on the one hand, it already exists, but you will have there won't be translations into English. It will be Korean literature written by Koreans in English. That's already happened. So that's one way that we're coming all the way back to pre-modern literature in Chinese, but also becoming very modern because there would be non-Korean, or at least non-pure Koreans, by the way conservative or nationalistic Koreans construct in their minds these identities, including a lot of children in Korea with Filipino mothers, Cambodian mothers, Vietnamese mothers, Chinese mothers. A lot of Korean men, especially outside of Seoul, are having a lot of trouble getting married, and so there are just a huge number of these international, that's the name, the direct translation, international marriages, and so the children are ethnically only half Korean, but they're the ones usually who, because they're outside of Seoul and they tend not to be very wealthy, are getting all of their education in Korean, not in English, and will be Korean citizens and perfectly fluent in Korean, and will not everybody, but even 1%, 2% of them will write poetry and write novels, and that will also be Korean literature. And then the last one, which is very complicated, is children being raised in Korea with no Korean blood, because we have in Korea now a lot of couples, married couples coming in, particularly from Southeast Asia, but also from all over the world. And the kids are native speakers, readers, and writers of Korean. So even if they speak something else at home with their parents, from first grade through university, everything's Korean. And they will write literature, and it will be Korean literature. And they will have very different and, I think, provocative and powerful stories that Koreans won't be able to write, right? It's like in America. You have a lot of very famous writers who I think become famous largely because they're great writers, but also because they have new stories. You have a kind of Jewish experience or a Korean American experience or a Latin American experience that mainstream Americans hadn't thought about. And when they read this, it's interesting and it's compelling. It's like, oh, I didn't realize that America is sometimes extremely unfair, or that America is sometimes extremely cruel. And I think these young writers who are either half Korean or totally un-Korean, but they're native speakers, readers and writers of Korean will have different stories, and in some ways more compelling stories. And again, going back to what I said earlier about hybridity, I don't think hybridity is a bad thing. I think hybridity is a wonderful thing, and I think hybridity strengthens culture. And so, you know, I won't be surprised. And here's an example. The flip side in Korea, so you know, Sandra Pop, right? Is she a Korean singer, or is she a Filipino singer, right? What do you think? She doesn't sing in Korean, really. She sings in English. How would you define her? Really? Why? Why? Is she her nationality screening? Okay, what if she had a Filipino passport? Why? Okay, so you're old-fashioned. I think that's going to change. I think that's going to change. Yeah. Yeah, right? I mean, that's the right answer. But anyway, it's, you know, I'm not saying I have the right answer. Everyone's going to have his or her own opinion. But I want you to think about that, like how this is, even now, it's developing and it's changing. And there's going to, or there'll be tomorrow or 10 years from now, someone named Sandra Pop, let's say, but only her dad is Pop and her mom is Filipina. And she will have a totally different identity. But she might be writing purely Korean poetry or purely Korean novels. But her story will be different because her mother is different. And she would probably go back and forth and visit her grandparents here. And she would experience different, both prejudices, both good and bad. So I think South Korea, at least, I don't know about North Korea, but South Korea, at least, is heading into an era where the definition of Korean literature has to expand, right? And in some ways, it has to be more modern, but in other ways, it's returning to pre-modern, because all Koreans were writing at one point in Chinese, but it was still Korean literature, right? So I don't know if I kept the time perfectly. I probably hurried too much, so I'm afraid I was over time. I'm like 30 minutes late. But I think it's okay, because just like I said with my lectures at school, I mean at Yonsei, I try to leave a lot of time for Q&A. So I would rather that we did an hour of Q&A instead of 30 minutes of Q&A, because that still winds up being my lecture on Korean literature, but rather than me unidirectionally lecturing at you while you fall asleep, you can actually ask me something that you're interested in, and then I can guide my lecture in that direction. So I will open, why don't we do this? If you need to use the restroom or get water or get coffee, it's 5 minutes, and then we can have Q&A for a full hour or more. I'll stay, I love doing this. I'll stay as long as you are. So take a 5-minute break.
5 minutes break.
I was so worried I was looking for time to skip this. It's so hard.
Pero tingnan mo dito, ang pagsulat ako, pinagpaganda, ito binabasa nila.
Walang
Di ba parang
lahat ng consonants.
Yung third one. Yung third letter. Sabi ka.
ano mo? Pero yung O, ay yung sa tulad yung sinabi niya kanina, may tatlo, di ba, na nasa baba. Pero pag doon,
Mas baba pa
yung third consonant. Pero tama na. Dati hindi ako nakasama.
Actually, kung yung sa O, magiging shared sila ng, parang 2 lines pa rin siya. Shared sila dito.
Hindi, nakarest sa auditioner ko lang sa baba.
Yes, ma'am. Hindi, itong dalawang parang shared sila dun sa space na yun. Kung titignan mo yung
Kasi wala
spacing.
naman talagang ano. Correct. Yung pa, yung space sa baba. Gano'n ko siya kalaki isusulat. Ano talaga.
Yun na, yung spacing.
Pero naalim ko parang
Spain.
mainit. Ano, kagabi ako na sa stop coffee. Hindi ko na siya tumingin.
Tumingin sa'yo.
Oo, nagsisimula ka. Pagpa-stop coffee. Sabi niya ko naman na yun. Hindi ako pa niya. Mag-braid ng buhay. Mag-braid, tsaka tayo nakabuhay. Yung dalawa yung laging tayo.
Mahal dito po
Eh, ito,
sa
pag ako ng ano,
sa
ng
baba.
R.
Sa baba ko lalagay.
Atin.
Kasi sila po.
Kaya ako nag-braid mo. Kung katamad ako
May
sumayin.
mahal kita. Ito po.
Binababa ko lang.
Ano na sinulat mo ba?
Mahal kita i-adjust ko lang. Hindi na lang siya ano eh.
Sarang eh.
Kaya sarang yun, mahal kita naman.
Ano nga ba ang sarang?
By stay. Very good.
Sarang. Ano nga ba?
Maiintindihan naman nila mahal. Nagkakatalo lang sa spelling kasi sa dami ng character. Iba-iba.
Tama yung kita ko, ma'am.
Ano po? Okay. Parang tapos style.
Add isang ganun lang.
Ma'am.
Ayan na.
Yung may tama, may buhit lang isa.
Ay, honey! Magtatap ka ba? Ano nga? Kayo sa publisher?
My friend Tato. I was visiting my friend from Tato.
Okay.
And then, but yeah.
Sa
And then sabi ko, yes, it would make sense.
Yes, di ba?
So you guys are teaching Korean in high school?
No, ako sa Evan Org. Kaka-boot up lang. Korean. Sarang
Took a while, ah. Tapos matagal na yung Korean.
action. Kamusta ka na? Tanda-danda naman. So, ganyan. Sarang.
Wow, cool.
Hindi ito.
Ayun. I believe in enjoy.
Eh, mag-picture tayo. Ayun, Joanne, pa-picture na.
Kumusta na, Jen? Papahead na kayo?
Naka-black ta. Ano siguro pa naka-black tayong tatlo? Tayo ka na lang. Yeah, thank you, Joanne. Thank you. Saan ka na nga ngayon? Okay. So, ganun. So, dapat yung... Ito. Tama. Kasi sarang heyo. Ano pag may sarang. 18. Sarang heyo. Iba or 8? Anong tanong?
sarang head mo ba?
He, sarang heyo lang.
Sarang head ko kasi.
Ako sarang heyo. Sarang... O, tama ako. Tapos yung...
Yung, ito mo.
Ito pa rin. AE. Sarang heyo. Yun. Tapos may doon. Kinikilig ako. Kahit na lang ang natutunan. Saka natutunan ko mag-gano. Ay, naka-black eye.
Mga mas maganda.
Yes.
Parang heyo. Kami sa Manila.
Okay na. Naantok mo pa.
That's si Mama nagpa-practice.
Para tayo. Pero hindi ka sa mga.
Yan yung confident ako.
O yun. Ay, ano ba yun? Yun ang dahilan? Pag hindi ka mahirapan magbuntis, oh my God.
Hindi. Kasi ka po.
Ganon, so kaya pala ako dito ito. Sabi ako acidic at saka toxic. Ay, talagang hirap naman. Anong gamot mo? Sa nag-omeprazole ka? Sa ganun ka?
Nagkamot ako.
Oo nga, hindi siya mukhang mas mukha pa akong nananakita sa kanya.
Bakit ganun?
Oo nga, ewan ko ba. Ewan ko ba kay Lord? Tingnan natin.
Baka mo ano, nasa Korea.
Buti na lang.
Nasa Korea.
Buti na.
Yung partner ni Pam.
Siya.
Nagko-concert pa kasi easy sa world tour.
Correct.
Partner ko ng waiting hall. Wala ko. Hintayin mo sa pasto.
Correct. Ayan.
Kailangan ng mahal.
Sarang sarang. Hindi siya talaga sarang. Sarang talaga. Hindi yung ibang yung sa ilang magkasama niya. Pag binabang may iba may energy siya. Batch yun. Hey, magkaliwala yun. Opo. H tapos A. Ito mama. Walang para sa
Bakit ito
yung below.
Bakit nasa taas siya rin siya? Third letter siya.
Hindi, dash siya doon.
Sa
Dash. Okay.
Tapos ano, syllable.
Syllable pa rin siya.
ito yung
Dash.
H.
Oo na, marunong na. Lagi may isang ano lang, syllable lang na. Halika pa, practice pa tayo. Sino naman artista? Si Song yan yun. Song. Tsaka man.
Tsaka man yung wait a minute.
Tsaka man. Ang tsaka mo. Song.
So why don't we begin Q&A? Like I said, I apologize for skipping over some of those slides. I was so worried about being late that I was first. I apologize. But we can revisit anything. Why don't we begin? That was a good question. There are no questions are off limits, by the way.
Well, it wasn't really a question. It was just more of adding to what you're saying about the diversity of Korean literature. Because I was pointing out that a lot of us now, I think, have many Korean students. So even in our classrooms, in our context, we have Korean Filipino literature that's coming out already. Especially we do a lot of writing in our classes. Because I think in my case, at the time I had 5 Korean students in my class. So for them, it's also a mix of Filipino Korean culture growing up. But most of them have been here since they were 5 years old, really with the intention to come here and learn English.
Yeah, it's a good point. And if they stay here, what they write would be in English because they're Korean. They might speak some Korean, but it would not be good enough to write a short story or a novel. They'd be writing English and writing a lot about their experiences in the Philippines. So you could, if they have a Korean passport, you might call it Korean literature. If they completely immigrated here, you might call it Filipino literature. But either way, that is going to be more diverse, right, and more hybridized. Yes.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Professor Frankl, for that wonderful presentation. I teach a Korean literature class, an elective, and as you correctly pointed out, our students are of course more interested in the modern period more than the pre-modern period. And after semesters of teaching, that is how I begin the course. Now, I just, similar to what you did, I have a run-through of slides explaining pre-modern, and then the entirety of the semester we talk about modern literature. We're reading now, because it's just the start of the SEM, Transgressor of the Nation. You have to forgive me, I'm a fake Korean teacher because I don't speak Korean. So we're reading in translation.
Is it in what language?
In English.
And it's called Transgressor?
Transgressor of the Nation is the English title. It's a here's the Korean title. Menjokwi Join.
I didn't know it was in English.
KLT, I translated it back in 2013. So, but my students have the e-copy of this Transgressor. Yes. Yeah, okay, so it's a Chemanchik, no? And this one, as you pointed out, during this period, of course, there were a lot of serialized stories that, if they become quite famous, they become novels. This is an example of such a thing. It was a serialized material that was turned into a novel. Now the question is, this came out in the 1940s, and yeah, it was serialized from 1945 to 1948 according to this. I don't know. So 1940s, and if you do the count, like this is like less than 40, 50 years since the Japanese officially took over. If you mention 1905, between 1905 to 1910. My students and I are slaving over what are the Choson remnants in the novel. It seems that there is this immediate turn to modernity. So my question would be, what is your take on this? There seems to be this gap. So immediately from 1905 to this, it seems that there are no more remnants of Choson. What happened to Choson during this period?
That is an excellent question. And I skipped over this because I thought we wouldn't have enough time, but this is a perfect example of me being able to direct my lecture to your questions. So this theory is the only thing today which is 100% mine. So I have a theory and I've written about it. You can look it up. Inverse modernity, and this is a term that I invented. When I received my PhD, the dean came up and he said, today over there at the law school they're graduating, and now if they pass the test they're qualified to be lawyers. And over at the med school they're graduating and they're qualified to be medical doctors. What about you guys? What does PhD mean? What are you qualified to do? And we're like, yeah. What are we qualified to do? And he said, you're qualified basically to create knowledge, right? And after you try to create knowledge, if your peers say that's ridiculous, it disappears, but if you get published and people use it, then it becomes your knowledge. So this is one of the few things that I came up with, but what it addresses exactly what you're talking about. So I begin with Ateneo, pure the blood, and I go to, I think, Timachik wrote Petropa in 1938. And in between, we have Mujang. I don't really memorize the dates. There's Manila, and then there's Three Generations. So there are these major novels each decade. And what I mean by inverse modernity, and this will help answer your question, is technological modernity moves forward in a very teleological way. So if you think of modernity as more cars, more trains, more radios, more cafes, more ability to drink cafe lattes in outdoor cafes at department stores, more people watching Hollywood films, which was big during the colonial period. This technology in all of these stories goes forward, and it's very clear that each decade there is a move away from tradition. And so like you said, like they're leaving, in terms of technology, they're totally leaving society behind. But what you see is the exact opposite is happening in terms of the way people think and behave and act. And so I'll give you a couple of concrete examples. So culture is becoming more traditional, while technology is becoming more modern. So if you look at Tears of Blood in 1906, just for one drastic, I could do 2 hours on this, but just one drastic example. In Tears of Blood, there's one family. It's a father, a mother, a daughter, and that's all. That's the family: father, mother, daughter. They never talk about having a son. They never want a son. They don't need a big family. There's no talk about the grandparents. There's just one grandfather who's not to come very briefly to give them money. And that's all. Now, by this time, and they live separately from the rest of their families. This is a nuclear family, very Western, very modern. And now, by the time we get here, everything is centered around the grandfather to his eldest son, to his eldest son, to his eldest son. And they live in huge hanok, traditional Korean houses. Even though the title here is 3 generations, there's actually 4 generations of the Jo family in Samdae, because Tokki, the youngest, actually has a child. So 4 generations, all living in one big traditional household. And inside the house, you must wear hanbok, and you must speak Korean, and you must be Korean. So the behavior and the dress and the kind of preferences are very traditional here, even though technologically they're much more modern. And the behavior and the dress and the preferences here are very modern, even though technologically they're so much closer to the American. This is a very interesting kind of inversion that we see up until the late 1930s. So I think you're right about technology, but when people are behaving, it starts to become more and more traditional. And again, this is partially explained again by pressure from Japan. Like I said about this Hamgyum Musa, pressure from the Mongols. The only, so you said Minjo Geche, right? You're reading it, and this idea of Minjo in the title, Minjo is not a nation state, it's an ethno-nation, right? The best word, it's not a perfect word. In context, Minjo can be race, and it can be ethnicity, and it can be nation. But if you use one word that really captures Minjo, it's ethno-nation. The nation based on ethnicity more than political statehood. Because from 1910 to 1945, there is no Korean nation. There's only Japan. But they're still Korean. There's still Korean language, there's still Korean culture, Korean food. So the idea of Minjok, and that's why Minjok is changed, right, in that title that you just said, becomes very important from 1910 to 1940, I think. Because what can Koreans preserve? They have not been able to preserve a political nation state, but they have been able to preserve the Minjok and Korean culture and food and clothing and all these things. So you can see why, as the colonial period gets deeper and technology is not Japanese, it's Western, the Western technology becomes more ubiquitous, that the stress on Korean culture becomes heavy. The preservation and even kind of development of Korean culture. Excellent question. We're eating together. I've been eating a lot. This is like my time that So I don't know if it's because because my lecture was so clear and perfect, or because you're bored?
Pero ayoko siya.
It happens to me after lunch. Yes. Right.
There are just some things that I'm not familiar with what I'm interested in as a teacher for high school. So I know you're used to teaching university students because of your diction and all these things, but I was just wondering because as a high school teacher, I'm teaching level 7 to 10 or sometimes until 12. So when you ask them what do you think about current literature, the most that I can get is comics, webtoons, and all this stuff, which are, sorry for the term, shallow. There's no like deep history meaning about it. So my question is like how personally for you, like how can you define the Korean way of writing? Because for example, Japanese when they write, they use haiku, so it's more inspired by nature. While Filipinos, they tend to lean on reading novels that are, in the romantic, we're more into reading those kind of stuff. So how can you define the Korean way of writing? Like what are they mostly inspired by?
Yeah, so it's an excellent question. So because I stress hybridity and complexity and diversity, one thing I would say is I think Koreans themselves, you will find Koreans that will give you an answer about, Koreans are very emotional. So, they have a lot of unrequited resentment. Because I think those are very dangerous and my point is this: the Koreans mistakenly believe that purity and simplicity and being unified is a positive thing. I don't find it positive. I don't find it negative either. I find it neutral. I don't find it positive. But what I find in Korea, Korean literature, Korean culture, Korean food, Korean language, even though Korea is a relatively small country, when you look at China, you look at the U.S., and even if you look at the Philippines, I mean, it's small because it's both small and connected, right? The Philippines has an island, and so traditionally there wouldn't be much, interaction, but Korea is all connected. I think Korea is tremendously diverse, and it's small, so I can drive 4 hours, which is not very far. It's like getting to the airport. And find totally different speech patterns, food, geography. You'd be from the ocean to the mountains, from someone speaking very slowly to someone speaking very quickly, and the accents are different. And I think the literature is the same. There's actually not just one thing, like Korean literature is A, or Korean literature is B, which is positive. And there is, the Koreans were brainwashed by the Japanese to believe in Ateneo, which is like a unified bloodline. It's true. And it's like unified culture, and they thought this was good, but I don't think it's good. I think Korea has a tremendous diversity of literature, but also food and drink and religious beliefs and all these things. So it would just, I think it's individual, but I think it really depends on individual authors and individual readers. And that's nice because your students could explore a variety of authors who are translated into English and maybe not like 3, but then find one, this is what I like. There is quite a range of approaches and subjects that creators are dealing with. Only we get to eat? That's so unfair.